Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War news update, the second part thereof for the 21st of April 2024. I did one, it seems like an eon ago this morning. It's been a very long day. Why has it been a very long day? I would have got to this a little bit earlier. I had other things to attend to, like an escape room, but also this. Okay, so that's my boy there, 13-year-old kid playing rugby. Scrum half. He's a little guy, but he's a pocket battleship. He's stacked. There he is. You know, doing the old rugby thing. Awesome. And that's what happened to his finger. Trigger warning. You might go, oh, hello. So his finger today was pointing in seriously the wrong direction. So that was several hours spent in accident and emergency at a local hospital. And it's all right. It's vaguely straight now. So he'll live to fight another day and hopefully play next week. But yeah, it's definitely not supposed to go in that direction. I've been led to believe that this is the wrong direction for a finger. However, all is good. Finn is all right now. So I've spent a lot of time in the hospital today. Well, would be like I would prefer to have been doing some videos. Okay, obviously the big news is the aid package was passed in the House of Representatives yesterday. To remind you really quickly, there are two parts to the US Congress. You have the House of Representatives, 438 of them, about 50-50 at the moment. There's the majority of one for the Republicans. And that's going to be key to what I explain in a second. And the Senate has 100 senators. There are 50 of each, 49, 51 that caucus with the Democrats. So they've got a majority there. Now, this is due to go to the Senate in 72 hours after this. So it'll be the 23rd. That's Monday, isn't it? No, goodness. So that's going to be Tuesday. And as soon as that gets passed, if it gets passed in the Senate, fingers crossed it should. The last one was the full package with everything, and that was 1729. And if it gets wrapped up again in one full package, then you'd expect that should pass in a similar fashion. I don't know whether there'll be any kind of pressure from the Freedom Caucus and the Republicans who are against aid to Ukraine in the meantime, so you might see a change in those numbers. Now, what is worth noticing, and I was really positive yesterday, of course I was, but I'm also pretty scared about the future of American politics at the moment. When you have a majority of Republican representatives voting against military aid to Ukraine and essentially for Russian, but essentially appeasing Russia, then that is a huge concern going forward. This is not over. There is just some, as far as I can see, fairly demented opinions from some of these politicians, but also the whole landscape is shifting, and I don't know what's happening, but what's the good news is that 99% of the Democrats voted yay, and in fact there were 0% of Democrats who voted nay. So only that 1% is that 3 Democrats did not vote. I don't know for what reason, but basically everyone that did vote, 100% of the Democrats that voted for Ukraine aid. So I think it's really clear which party is serious about helping Ukraine. So if you're pro-Ukrainian out there and you're Republican, I'll be interested in what your views on this are, because I think it's becoming increasingly challenging, and it shouldn't do. I don't get it to be a Republican and confident in your support for Ukraine without getting lambasted by people in your party. I've seen such insane rhetoric from those who voted against, and we'll come back to that. So anyway, when it did happen, this is what happened. This is important because we'll come back to this point as well. So this is the moment that the House voted.
On this vote, the ayes are 311 and the nays are 112. The bill is passed. Oh, one voting present. I missed it, but thank you. Okay.
So, not the moment they voted, the moment it was called, and you see the Democrats on this side cheering. I mean, this is a really big thing for them, waving Ukrainian flags there.
Will be in order.
Republicans generally sitting down. One of them did put their arm up, but there's a big difference.
My colleagues to observe proper decorum. Flag waving on the floor is not appropriate. The House will be in order.
And that's technically correct, but a few Republicans were pretty sour about that. And again, we'll return to that in a second. So here we have the split. 218 Republicans. There, 3% of them didn't vote. 51% were against. 46% in favour. And for the Democrats, 99% in favour and 1% did not vote. 72% overall vote. So about, or coming up for 3/4. But it really shouldn't be. It should be far more than that. But that's the state of affairs in American politics. And before the vote, US Republican lawmaker here, what's his name, Don Bacon, said that he hit out on members of his own party who are opposed to sending military aid to Ukraine, saying they would like to see the Russians win. And I think that seems to be the case for many of them. But he laid out the dire situation that Ukraine finds itself in on the battlefield, saying if the bill does not pass, the Russians will be in Kiev. Well, luckily it has passed. Zelensky was obviously very grateful. This is what he said after the vote came through. He's obviously pleased about that. But actually, what I want to play you is what he subsequently said.
You said this week, President Zelensky, that Ukraine would have no chance of winning without more U.S. support. And I guess the question is, can Ukraine now win this war, or is the United States merely giving you enough aid to prolong this war?
Thank you. I think this support will really strengthen the armed forces of Ukraine. And we will have a chance for victory if Ukraine really gets the weapon system, which we need so much, which the thousands of soldiers need so much. And this aid should not be just spread in thin layer all over, but it has to end up in tangible weapon systems, some really crucial weapon system which are hard to get, the long-range artillery, and I really appreciate that it mentions ATACMS, so long-range weapons, and it's important because we need long-range weapons to not lose people on the front line, because we have casualties because we cannot reach that far. Our weapons are not that long range, so we need it, and air defense. This is crucial. These are the priorities now.
Exactly what I've been saying, that Ukraine can win this war if they just stand off and fire lots of missiles at Russia. Again, we saw a Neptune missile, not again a Neptune, but a ship being taken out with a long-range missile. It's just one long-range missile flung into Sevastopol this morning, and there's a salvage ship that has been hit. If they can send one a day at Sevastopol,
you said this week
you would not have the Black Sea Fleet at all if they could keep doing that to Novorossiysk. I mean, just long-range weapons like ATACMS is so super important. So I'm really happy that he recognises that, and of course he should recognise that because it's commonsensical. If I'm coming up with that idea and I think it's pretty sound, then of course that's going to be what military personnel are going to be thinking. The whole idea is you don't lose people. We need long-range people so we don't lose people. There's no point taking territory back by throwing soldiers at fully armed defensive fortifications when you could hammer those defensive fortifications with long-range munitions, and also the logistics behind those fortifications. If you take out all these key like air bases and ships so they can't hit you, if you are debilitating the enemy at a distance, then you eventually get to a stage where you should be able to just walk it over quite slowly and not take those huge casualties because you've done all the work with your distance munitions. Right, Chuck Schumer has said, as mentioned, April the 23rd is when the Senate will vote on the bills, including Ukraine aid. If adopted, which you are highly likely will, aid can be on its way to Ukraine by the end of the week. So lots of talk about that. Pentagon spokesman Patrick Ryder said the first tranche of weapons from the USA will arrive in Ukraine a few days after signing the law. There's been this idea that it's just ready to go, possibly even in places like Germany and Poland, just ready to just be thrown into Ukraine toot sweet. US officials have not publicly said what weapons will be sent, but it is likely to include more air defense ammo and artillery. I mean, Thomas Tyner has said his wish list, and it is lots of long-range missiles, ATACMS, all sorts of ATACMS, unitary and cluster munitions, 100,000 cluster munition shells for artillery, all sorts of stuff can be sent and I think should be sent. Now, Ben Hodges, former commander of the US forces in Europe on the approval of the assistance package for Ukraine, says, quote, "It may be weeks before we see significant battlefield effects of this decision, but the strategic effect will be felt immediately in the Kremlin, where they now realize that the plan to wait for us to quit has failed." I'm going to return to that idea in a wee while. Shashank Joshi said, though, the sad truth is that had a supplementary bill passed 6 months ago, Ukraine would have lost less ground, though it would have still lost some, inflicted greater casualties on Russia during the time, and incurred fewer of its own, both important in an attritional war. Yeah, absolutely. So think how, I think, difficult Russia are finding it right now. Imagine where they'd be at if they'd had 7 months of this kind of stuff being thrown at them. The ATACMS that we saw recently on Jankoy. Imagine you'd had 6 months of ATACMS hammering Russia. Goodness me. And then, 10 minutes of flag waving, 10 minutes of waving another country's flag because America agreed to support Ukraine's freedom and democracy from Russian aggression, says Sean Pinner, who was captured in Mariupol and tortured and was swapped in an exchange with Medvedchuk. Everything the US stands for, yet the anxiety created for millions of people by the very politicians who are complaining about it is just baffling. If you do not think Russia wants to see the downfall of America, you are very naive or a Russian sympathizer. So here it is again for those moaning about the majority who did the right thing in protecting the USA and Ukraine. 10 minutes of venting relief. Now, Sean Pinner has been absolutely vocal the last few days, talking about people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and the positioning of some of these reprehensible voices in Congress. Please go and check the chat I had with Sean Pinner about his experiences of fighting for Ukraine since 2018, being captured and being tortured and then eventually prisoner swapped. It's a criminally underviewed video, that one from 6 days ago. Please check it out. The only 4.3 thousand people have watched it. I mean that not in regards to watch my videos for some benefit to me. I mean, I was so honoured to speak to him. It was such an incredible experience to speak to him that should be viewed by a lot more people. So please check that out if you haven't already. Sean Pinner then says 75% of the House voted in favour. I think you seriously have to rethink about who you call traitors. I've nearly died too, and I think it's great news for America. So what's he responding to? Well, this is Colonel Rob Maness, retired, an American retired colonel, saying, "I cannot find strong enough words to describe my feelings over this un-American action," that's waving the Ukrainian flags in the House of Representatives, in our Congress. "Can't believe I've killed and nearly lost my own life for these traitors. I would like you to explain why these people are traitors." Colonel Rob Maness. I don't care whether don't care that you're a veteran. You can still be insanely wrong, and that is what you are. Okay, talking about flags waving in the Capitol, I wonder if Colonel Rob Maness had a problem with this flag being waved in Congress, or these flags during January the 6th. I don't know. I wonder if there's any double standards going on. As Bill Pascrell Jr., and we'll return to him, some of my Republican colleagues enraged at me for waving a Ukrainian flag today. Somehow I had no problem with January the 6th Trump rioters waving Confederate flags in our capital. Weird. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, when you have a go at people waving flags, did you have a go at these people? I don't think you did. I think you now call them, hostages? Is that what you call them? Yeah, okay. And Sean Pinner again here, talking about what Dimitri from War Translated says. So let's go to Dimitri from War Translated, who looks at these Russian sources and says, right, in addition to direct assistance, the Russians, so that's the military aid from the US to Ukraine, the Russians are very concerned about the confiscation of frozen assets. This is true. There's been a lot of talk about this in Russian media. It's nearly the most important topic for discussion. Of course, Putin is primarily to blame here, not the United States. It was Putin who decided to launch a 3-day police operation expecting immediate success. It's his fault that for 3 years now, Russia has not even been able to fulfill its political goals of capturing the Donetsk region. So all questions should be addressed to our own management, please, to your own management, please. And as Sean Pinner adds, totally agree. The pressure this puts on Putin is immense, in my view, as all these countries will look to seize Russian assets, and as we know, Russia is all about the money. This is all Putin's bad planning and major cock-up. Russia has immensely more to lose than the West, and could ultimately lead to his demise. Take the lot. And then we have now. I did my live last night with Greg Terry. Greg Terry is a Reagan Republican who is an anti-Trumper who despises Marjorie Taylor Greene and is a massive fan of getting an aid package through Congress to Ukraine. But he's also met Victoria Spartz, who's a Ukrainian-born from Chernihiv, Ukrainian-born Republican representative. And she weirdly voted against the aid yesterday and has caused all sorts of backlash. She wanted some amendments that would take away the presidential drawdown authority and stop funding for refugee families and children. And it's made people's minds get blown, including mine. Now, Greg says, look, I know her, I've talked to her, I've got a sense of who she is. And I am not going to criticize her, and you shouldn't criticize her until you know the data, the details, the information. Why there must be a reason she has done this, and I'd agree to a point. There must be a reason she's done this, and I'd like to know what it is. But I'm going to speculate, and I'm going to say I think the MAGA claws are into her. And she's looking at her base, she's looking at the people around her, she's been convinced by the people around her, she's looking at the upcoming election, all sorts of things like that. And I have to say, actions speak louder than words. So she may have said X, Y, and Z in the past, and to whomsoever, but she voted in that way, and she tried to add those amendments in the way that she did. And I have no problem with criticising Victoria Spartz myself, because and a lot, just look, she's receiving an awful lot of hassle from Ukrainians and pro-Ukrainians for her position. Lots of people saying she should be primaried and lose her political position as representative in her district. So anyway, lots of consternation over that. Now, Thomas Tyner says here, Anton Gerashchenko is 100% correct. The Russians are, to us, a classic US Army term, FUBAR, effed up beyond all recognition. Deserves them right, he says. What's he talking about? Well, Anton Gerashchenko says this. It seems that the approval of aid to Ukraine by US Congress came as a big surprise to Russia. So we're looking back now at the Russian reaction in media and so on. Judging by their reaction, they had no plan B and believed there would be no help. But it turns out that now Ukraine and the West are destroying the remnants of the high-tech part of the Russian army to bring it back to the 20th century. Another year of such a war and all Russia will be left with will be last century weapons and meat assaults. Aviation, especially strategic aircraft, and the Navy will be largely destroyed. I don't know I'd be so confident in saying that, but nonetheless. Meanwhile, NATO and China continue to increase their high-tech weaponry stocks. Russia is playing tactics in Ukraine and losing strategically in a direct confrontation with NATO. It has less and less chances. Well, I agree with that. I think NATO would snuff out Russian military in days, weeks, really. Especially the ground forces are relatively non-existent anymore compared to the combined NATO forces. Now, it's all about nuclear weapons, though, for Russia, isn't it? Aid to Ukraine is essentially an ultimatum. It will now be about exhausting Russia. Yesterday's statements by Medvedev and Peskov are full of confusion and spite. So we'll pop into what Peskov said on seizing Russian assets. Quote: "If it's really about confiscating our assets," this is Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, "the USA will answer for that. Moscow will take measures in accordance with our interests and no time limits." In other words, that's really interesting. There's no time limits. We'll take measures, which is to say, damn, there's not a lot we can do now. But if we don't put any time limits on it, we will get our revenge just when we can. On aid to Ukraine, the decision will make the USA even richer and will make Ukraine still poorer. More Ukrainians will die. Medvedev wished civil war on the US. It was voting of joyful US bastards. A, to continue the civil war of the separated people of our once united country. What? B, to increase the number of victims of this war as much as possible. We will, of course, win, despite the $61 billion of bloody dollars that will mostly go down the throat of their insatiable military production complex. Power and truth are with us, which is interesting because actually that's an argument against the MAGA Republican viewpoint, which is this money's just going to Ukraine. He's literally saying most of that money will stay in the US. Can't have it both ways, guys. But considering the Russophobic decision that took place, I can't help but wish the USA with all sincerity to dive into a new civil war themselves as quickly as possible, which I hope will be very different from the war between North and South in the 19th century and will be waged using aircraft, tanks, military, MLRS, all types of missiles and other weapons, and which will finally lead to the inglorious collapse of the vile, evil empire of the 21st century, the United States of America. Ouch. So they are smarting about the aid package. And there is news out today from Mark Warner, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, I think on CBS, saying that ATACMS will be sent to Ukraine by the end of next week, or could well be sent to. There's different ways of interpreting what he said, but nonetheless, ATACMS are looking very much on the cards. Right. Now let's go to the rest of military aid and equipment outside of the US aid package. But we are going to stay with the US to begin with. The US considers sending up to 60 military advisors to Ukraine, said Pentagon spokesman General Patrick Ryder. The advisors would not be in a combat role, but would rather advise and support the Ukrainian government and military. Interesting. So we had previously the idea that people like Cavoli, in charge of the US military in that part of the world, in that European sector, were not able to go into Ukraine because of rules about like high level military personnel not being in such a risky place. Well, actually, the British Admiral Radkin and other military personnel from like the UK, some other countries, we don't have those rules. And what that's meant is that some countries can do really close work with Ukraine in Ukraine, and that's really advantageous for certain reasons. And other times, Ukrainians have to go out to, say, Germany or Poland to meet with American counterparts. I don't know whether this is referring to anyone particularly senior, but the idea that you're starting to get this idea of military personnel working with inside Ukraine, you're blurring those lines, and it's kind of a mission creep, isn't it? So the idea of Macron saying, "Hey, we're not ruling out sending French troops into Ukraine for one reason or another," suddenly that becomes more plausible and more acceptable if you've already got certain military personnel working within different places. And that may be just confined to embassies and whatnot. I don't know. Lithuania has delivered a new military aid package to Ukraine. Now, today, said the Lithuanian MD, another shipment of Lithuanian military aid reached Ukraine. We delivered a disassembled light attack aircraft, the L-39ZA, that was sort of packed up and put into into a lorry. We delivered that L-39ZA Albatross to the Ukrainian Armed Forces. It was used by the Lithuanian Army to train fighter control officers, ensuring pilots' combat readiness. So that's going to be used with regard to fighter pilot training. Britain is preparing a new air defense package for Ukraine to be delivered within weeks after Volodymyr Zelensky pleaded for more protection from the West. I think I'm not sure that we're going to be particularly good at providing anything like Patriots because we don't have them. But I think what Ukraine definitely need, if you look over Chasiv Yar at the moment, places like that, and Avdiivka, where the Russians are just using their air force with impunity almost over the zero line, you're thinking they need some serious man-pads there, man-portable air defense systems like your Stingers. Well, UK does have Martlets that we provided. and Starstreak and with martlets, that we have those kind of equivalents that would be super useful. We provided them before. I would expect stuff like that to be in such a package. Ukraine definitely need that stuff. Norway's launched a new grant program for Ukrainian NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and is allocating almost 6 million euros to fund it. These funds will help democratic reforms, strengthening the rule of law and the role of civil society as Ukraine pursues European integration. Thank you, Norway. That's brilliant. All that stuff would be so useful for helping Ukraine on its way to an eventual EU accession. Now, the Vice Chancellor of Germany and Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Robert Habeck, offered to share the necessary equipment for Ukraine from closed energy facilities in Germany, which is really good news. So Germany's offered to open up their decommissioned power plants so Ukrainian specialists can examine them to see if any parts can be salvaged and sent to Ukraine for repairs on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. We saw that previously. That offer has been made by Latvia, Lithuania or Estonia, one of the Baltics. I can't remember which one. Russians may have received 203mm shells from Iran. The supply indicates growing defense cooperation between the countries, complementing the list of other calibers that Iran has been supplying to Russia. So again, worrying that Iran is such a close cooperative partner with Russia. This axis of evil stuff is definitely a worry, and we know that Iran have provided Shahed drones, of course. That's the top line item, isn't it? But also ballistic missiles, possibly cruise missiles, or both. And for artillery shells to be provided is a real challenge to Ukraine. However, it also shows that Russia are desperate for them as well. So whenever we see these worrying bits of news about, Russia has received this amount of artillery ammunition from this country, that's not likely to last forever. There's going to be bottlenecks in world production, I think, of these kind of things. And someone like Iran and North Korea might struggle to get some of the raw materials, although China produces a nitrocellulose. Anyway, point being that although this might be a short-term game for Russia, it shows that they are seriously lacking to be desperate to go to anywhere to get these shells. And B, I think North Korea and Iran might be in a worse position going forward to compete with the Western military-industrial capacity around the world in making shells. Okay. Students are forced to make trench candles in Russia. It's the sort of thing we see like Ukrainian families and kids and whatnot doing this, and we celebrate it. And yet we look at this and go, that's terrible. Rubbish. Russia rubbish. But actually for good reason. So if you are invaded by an aggressive genocidal army who is trying to do horrible things to your country and snuff it out of existence, then everyone pulls together and does things above and beyond. You get families and kids pulling together to help their parents, their families, and on the front lines. And that is a really wonderful thing to see. When you get this kind of almost child labour element to kids doing this in Russia, all this is presented by the Kremlin propaganda as a public initiative. Instead, the forced production is counted as a credit, and an absence is a reason for parents to be summoned into school. Students are forced to make trench candles to Russia. When you're doing that for the invading genocidal army, it takes on a very different flavour, in my opinion. And I think, for me, this is just terribly sad. As I mentioned, the Lithuania stuff already, that's out of place. Now, here we had the Russians continuing to withdraw troops from Nagorno-Karabakh in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict area and take out their BTR-82As, likely on their way to Ukraine. So a number of these have been spotted on trains and on roads as well. I think they pulled out there for the sole reason that they need the personnel and the equipment in Ukraine. And again, what does this tell you? It tells you that Russia is in dire straits at the moment, I think, to keep their army fully supplied and keep attacking in a manner that they have been attacking, for the last 6 months. But that itself is in a different manner to they were attacking a year and a half ago, because they're now attacking often with 3, 4, 5. If they're really pushing it, maybe 16 pieces of equipment, tanks, IFVs, APCs. whereas a year and a half ago that might have been 60 attacking, or 30 here, 30 there, and it just they are operating as if they are struggling for equipment, and they are losing phenomenal amounts. Now, this is not to do, this is a UK-centric little nugget here, but Thomas Steiner says NATO members who have announced plans to expand their military substantially. And here we have Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Czechia, Estonia, that's Lithuania, and Latvia. And then those NATO members who are keeping their military at approximately the current size. So we've got Albania. Talked about Albania wanting to start up production of artillery shells and mortar. And I meant to say that they are, you might not think it, a NATO country, I believe. So Belgium, Canada, Croatia, yes, it actually says it there. Germany, Italy, France, US, Finland, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, what do we have there? Luxembourg, of course, Slovakia and Slovenia, Spain, North Macedonia, Portugal, Turkey, and Montenegro. And the only nation in NATO, sorry, it's a long time, I was just doing a bit of flag quiz. The only nation who's shrinking their military at a time when our military's been criminally underfunded is the British. So we're doing quite a good job of providing stuff for Ukraine, but as a percentage of GDP, it's not great. And now, Thomas Steiner, who politically, he's a bit all over the place. I've seen him say things that seem very conservative, and seen him say things that are very critical of conservatives. Here he says the British Tories just can't do defence. Now, they are the party that you would expect to do defence. Now, they are going to get an absolute trouncing in November. The question is, what will Labour do? I think it's an interesting one, because doesn't seem to be an awful lot of money kicking about, and robbing Peter to pay Paul. What will they do? Anyway, now we're going to go on to geopolitical things, and I know I've been speaking for an awful long time already. Goodness me, 30 minutes. It's going to be a bit of a long one today. This is what a decent, I think, representative does. This is a chap I mentioned earlier, Bill Pascrell Jr. He's a Democrat. To all the Republicans who just booed me and my colleagues on the House floor for Ukraine flags, here's my answer. Screw Putin and Slava Ukraini. This is what I want to see an American politician do, and this is what I want to see them be like, right? And yet this is what we get. Marjorie Taylor Greene. There she is, Marjorie Asset Taylor. Quote, the most important thing, she says, we can do is funding a useless war instead of securing a border and reducing inflation. Ukraine is not even a member of NATO. We shouldn't be sending money to foreign countries to kill foreign people. Peace is what we need, or to translate that, appeasing Putin is what we need, says Marjorie Taylor Greene. And check this out. So this is coming from a tabloid, very right-leaning newspaper, the New York Post, right? And it's quite a sight. Niet Moscow Marjorie. Oh, I wonder if you might see some people turning on her. Now, you've got this interesting situation where the Republican Party is experiencing a schism between the MAGA Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, Matt Gaetz, Jim Jordan, etc., and all of whom voted no for the aid. And then you get the sensible ones, but they are now under half of those who voted, at least. But we're going to come on to it in a little while. Why did Mike Johnson change his tack and go strongly for backing the bill? One thing that apparently was taking place is that a number of moderate Republicans said, if this bill doesn't go to the floor, we will resign. Just like Mike Gallagher did and Ken Buck did. And if we resign, you will lose your majority speaker, and Hakeem Jeffries will be the majority speaker for the Democrats, because the Republicans only have a majority of one. So if it takes 3 or 4 going, then that magic number will flip over to the Democrats being the majority party. And so Mike Johnson kind of had to do that. He had no choice. But you are getting this growing division in the Republican Party. Now the question is, where are Fox News going to go? Where are New York Post going to go? Which horse are they going to back there? do they see a future of the Republican Party if it gets fully taken over by the Trump MAGA cult? And if that happens, how electable really are they? When you look at the growing popularity of Biden and the Democrats, and I'm not talking from my point of view, I'm literally from the polls. All the polls are showing growing. He's now on average getting above Trump. Trump's got legal problems that are mounting. He's appealing to the far right, but not to the center. You've got young people who are increasingly, it appears, going back to Biden and the Democrats. And I think some of the latest polls are showing black and minority voters also moving back in that direction. You've had the Kennedy family. Every Kennedy family member's just come out and ditched their own Kennedy family member who's running as a third party candidate, and they have all backed Biden. And so there are if you're going to read the tea leaves, what are you going to predict as a newspaper, as a media entity, as someone like Rupert Murdoch? Who are you going to back? Do you see Trump as uniting? Or do you try and back the moderate Republicans and take the mickey out of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene? If you take the mickey out of Marjorie Taylor Greene, then you are, by extension, trying to amplify the importance and the sense of these moderate Republicans, which is itself a message to Trump to say, these are the people you want to be backing Trump. Don't keep getting involved in this shit show, this clown show around here that involves Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jim Jordan and Paul Gosar, and etc., etc. They will not win you the plurality of American votes. They will not win you a presidential election. You've got to be sensible, and you've got to try and attract the centre voters, the swing voters, or you will not win. And so I think there's going to be a big fight within the Republican Party, and that fight is on, and it will involve donors as well. So where the Republican Party is failing to get donors and the Democrats are getting record donations, Trump said he got $50 million, but he didn't. So they are failing to get donors, which means that they are the RNC and the Trump campaign that have merged are now. So that funding is going towards his legal bills predominantly, and it means there's a lack of money for down ticket political campaigns. So you've got your House of Representatives lawmakers, your senators, you've got your governors, and then you've got your people in the individual state senates and the state legislatures who will need funding for their campaign. But they're finding that there's no funding available because the donors are not paying, and the donors are not paying into the RNC because they see, one, the money's going to Trump's legal fees, and two, it's going to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and this nut job mental side of the Republican Party, and they don't back that as winning the election, so they're not going to throw millions of dollars at that. So there is some really serious thinking to be done for the Republican strategists who have to try and work out a way that they can get a Republican victory in the presidential election. And I know lots of people think Trump's got a good chance. I'm one of the people that has long said Trump will not. I don't think he will win, all things remaining equal, unless like Biden trips over and breaks his leg and shows himself to be really physically weak or something like that. I think if everything remains as it is and the economy remains buoyant, then Biden should win the election, and then you will have this moment where the Republican Party have to decide, if that happens in November 2024, do they go that way or do they go that way? Do they blame the election on not going hard right enough, or do they blame the election on not going centrist enough? It may only be solved by having two parties coming out of that, but then they will never get voted in again because you're splitting the vote two ways completely, and the Democrats will just get a shoe-in every time. So this is a really, I'm spending a lot of time on this because this is super important in terms of American politics going forward, but also in terms of Ukraine aid continuing. If the Republican Party sort of really trip up in November and the Democrats do well, then that will assure Ukraine aid more than I think if there's Republican victory. And here's someone who I think is what you want to see in Congress, in my opinion. So this is Representative Marcy Kaptur. Timothy Snyder saying she's an Ohio treasure and a national treasure. She's been so good on Ukraine and so good on social justice. Okay, so what's she do here? Well, she's actually quoting the legendary Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko, super famous Ukrainian, on the House floor. And kind of, I guess this is what certainly what I like to see. And it's such a refreshing change from listening to the likes of Moscow Marjorie.
Words of Ukraine's poet laureate Taras Shevchenko, who died almost 2 centuries ago in a ghastly prison, just like Alex Navalny died a few weeks ago in a ghastly Russian prison. Why?
Nice.
Because they believe in liberty. Quote, "The time is near when on Ukraine's plains a shackled folk will burst its chains. Blessed be your children in these lands. By touch of your toil-hardened hands, then shall our day of hope arrive. Ukrainian glory shall revive. Today is that day. Support liberty for Ukraine. Defeat Russian tyranny." Words of Ukraine's...
Brilliant stuff. And to see her standing up and hear her standing up and saying that so proudly in Congress is that's what I think is responsible. So Marjorie Taylor Greene is getting a bit of a hard time. Here you can see this is where Hakeem Jeffries, and this whole 4.5 minutes is well worth listening to, by the way. But this is where he calls her Moscow Marjorie, and I think that might stick.
From the extreme MAGA Republicans. Third, we were told that the national security needs of the American people could not be met until we reauthorized the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Even though we were promised, after finishing the spending bill, that the first order of priority upon our return to Washington in April would be national security legislation. But we had to deal with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which Democrats once again helped get over the finish line. Extreme MAGA Republicans, as we have observed, are out of excuses, and the American people and our allies in Ukraine and throughout the world are out of time in terms of our national security needs being met. Hopefully we're on track for that to happen tomorrow. We've been very honest in our assessment of the situation from the very beginning, including in the declaration that I made in late February. And at the appropriate time, as House Democrats, we will have a conversation about how to deal with any hypothetical motion to vacate, which at this point hasn't been noticed. Moscow, Marjorie Taylor Greene,
Ouch.
Massey, and Gosar are quite a group. And I'm sure that will play some role in our conversation. But central to the conversation, the prerequisite to the conversation, is to make sure that the national security legislation in totality is passed by the House of Representatives.
Oh, look, the adults are in a room, Marjorie. That's what happens when you are a responsible adult. This is what happens when you are not.
Math and show you just how triggered these MAGA Republicans got.
Constituents, but will you ever? But I mean, given what you said, do Republicans deserve to be in the majority?
That's up to the people, because this is the third betrayal by Mike Johnson. He delivered a 2-part omnibus, funded the Department of Justice, 91 federal indictments against President Trump, funded the FBI that raided Mar-a-Lago, gave him a brand new FBI building, funded Joe Biden's open border policies that are killing Americans every single day. Then he reauthorized FISA that spied on American citizens, spied on President Trump's campaign, and he voted against the warrant requirement, the same warrant requirement that he was for 6 months ago. And then he did this bullshit in here on the House floor, foreign war package that does nothing for America. It's unbelievable. I'm thankful that America gets to see who this man is. I'm thankful that America gets to see who the people that voted for this is. Because
I'm thankful America gets to see who you are.
This is the only way it's going to change. People have to see the truth.
And, he does great analysis there, pondering politics. But, Marjorie Taylor Greene, goodness me. Anyway, there's a really great piece in the Daily Beast, a whiplash as Russia toasts derided Marjorie Taylor Greene as their top new hero, from fool to tool, from Julia Davis, who does the Russian Media Monitor. So now Russia's former favourites have been edged out by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, the new darling of the Kremlin-controlled state television. In the past, Greene was routinely mocked for her uneducated statements and used as a prime example of how stupid all Americans are. She's not just saying that, Julia Davis. That is literally, and she's linking that. That is literally how the Russians saw her. Which is a popular refrain in Russian media. After laughing at Greene for confusing gazpacho, I don't even remember this, with the Nazi Gestapo, and claiming that California wildfires had been caused by Jewish space lasers, leading propagandists described her antics as evidence of a mental debilitation of Western politicians. So she was once derided by the Russian propagandists, but the mood changed once Greene started to say things that Russian propaganda apparatus found extremely useful. Her tweets that labelled NATO as a useless organisation and demanded the US withdraw from the alliance it is currently leading were featured on state TV and described as sensational. Greene's rhetoric has been interpreted by state TV host Yevgeny Popov to mean that, quote, she believes the Americans should help Putin win. She believes that Americans should help Putin win. Yes, you heard that right, to help him win in Ukraine. Greene's baseless claims that the US is, quote, supporting Nazis in Ukraine were likewise lauded by state TV propagandists and showcased on multiple channels. All this is hyperlinked for evidence. Previous mockery did not deter the state-controlled media from gladly using Greene's misleading statements to their advantage. The US Congresswoman was starting to become a long-distance darling for the Moscow crowd, prominently featuring on state television and adored to the point that the Kremlin's favourite propagandist Vladimir Solovyov proclaimed, thank goodness she exists. The importance of influential Westerners repeating the Russian talking points is constantly underscored by the head of RT, Margarita Simonyan, who admits that her state-controlled network is running covert operations in the United States and other countries. She's described RT's efforts, Russia Today's efforts, as the, quote, empire of covert projects that is working with public opinion. I mean, this is what they admit. They admit that they're trying to sway public opinion in other countries with their propaganda. Greene is now routinely showcased on the most popular programs as a prime example that the cracks in the GOP support for Ukraine are good signals from Washington. Solovyov and the guests on his show even touted Marjorie as a possible replacement for Russia's perennial favourite Donald Trump as the next US president, while acknowledging that the Congresswoman is somewhat funny. Greene's latest hijinks have firmly cemented her status as one of Moscow's most useful tools. Leading propagandists lauded her efforts to threaten Mike Johnson's speakership for his belated decision to allow a vote on the life-saving US aid to Ukraine. They similarly rejoiced over a flurry of amendments to the Ukraine bill that Greene filed with the House Rules Committee, including one to require any member who votes in favour of the package, quote, to conscript in the Ukrainian military. Greene filed more than 20 amendments to the bill, and most of them sounded as though they'd been handcrafted by Russia's Foreign Affairs Ministry. Some of them demand that Ukraine close all its bio-laboratories to prove that, quote, Christian churches in Ukraine are able to operate free from government interference, which is, of course, all nonsense, and bar funding until, quote, restrictions on Hungarians in Transcarpathia and other minorities are lifted. In light of Greene's own prior statements, one might imagine that the plight of Hungarians in Transcarpathia is not something she would organically discover or take any interest in. Perhaps coincidentally, the same narratives are being actively promoted by the Russian media, and this is underscoring this growing belief that basically she is some kind of useful tool for the Russians, and maybe more explicitly so. So some of her rhetoric seems to be lifted directly from Russian propaganda or Russian talking points, such that it's almost like she is being fed them by someone somewhere somehow. Anyway, to continue, during Thursday's broadcast of the evening with Vladimir Solovyov, expert on America Dmitry Drobnitsky, urged everyone to stop focusing on Mike Johnson and instead pay attention to Greene. He said, quote, the issue is not with Johnson. Speaker Johnson is not the one who is running Congress. Marjorie Taylor Greene is running Congress. It's all about those to whom she is willing to give them money. Everyone is afraid of her. She is everywhere, on every committee, involved in all impeachments. This is a curious phenomenon in the camp of our real enemy. These are, and listen to what they say, America is our real enemy. So they're saying the America's our real enemy. Meanwhile, Marjorie Taylor Greene and her ilk are saying, Russia's not our real enemy, it's Ukraine. But Russia is saying, you guys are our enemy. It blows my mind every day. Anyway, this is a curious phenomenon in the camp of our real enemy. These are the kinds of people they have working in their Congress. Florida Democratic Representative Jared Moskowitz offered his own amendment that would appoint Green, quote, as Vladimir Putin's special envoy in the United States Congress. The Russians seem to agree. Ouch. And in fact, here is Moskowitz on Midas Touch. I mean, this is a really fascinating 11-minute
Do you think
interview.
they got the message, and what was going through your mind at that?
Yeah, well, first, it's enough. It's enough of Marjorie's colleagues sitting there looking normal while she's saying the reason why we can't support Ukraine is because they're like Germany in the late 30s and early 1940s. No, they're not. The Ukrainians are not the Nazis. There aren't concentration camps there. They're not putting people on trains, railing them in. They haven't created a Dewey Decimal System of death with numbers on people's arms.
Wow.
Okay. There's not gas chambers or ovens. Okay. It's ridiculous, right? 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. 10 million people were killed by the Nazis. They tried to take over an entire continent. Okay. Ukraine is just trying to preserve their own territory from being invaded by Putin. And Moscow Marge is trying to, do this Nazi thing, which is literally what Putin is saying. It's the identical argument. And then she, wants to, she thinks she's funny by filing amendments on Jewish space lasers on the Israel aid package. I mean, we don't need Marge's help. Okay. It's just, she's not the spokesman for the Jewish people. And I just think it's outrageous the way she uses the Holocaust, and the tragedy and the history of that was erasing of a people, and tries to conflate that of the foreign policy disaster and nightmare going on in Ukraine. It's beyond offensive. It's just enough of it. And I'm just tired of her colleagues sitting there and letting her do that. Why do we have to be the ones, to tell her to shut up? It's their responsibility to do that. It's beyond acceptable in the halls of Congress. As far as James is concerned,
yes, it goes on to talk about James Comer, but absolutely on point. Why are we the ones that had to tell her to shut up? Her own party should be telling her to shut up. She's mental. So, okay, going on to other geopolitical ideas here. So, what made Speaker Mike Johnson change his mind about Ukraine? Mike Johnson has been stalling Ukraine aid for months, each time giving a different excuse, says Roman Sheremetyev. But yesterday he came with a very clear message condemning Russia and expressing his support of Ukraine. Why? Well, I think it might have an explanation. Last week, I wrote that one of the reasons the US is more willing to help Israel than Ukraine is that Israel has a very strong and systematic lobby in the US. Totally agree. For example, there are strong religious ties with the Protestant community. Ukraine needs to build the same strong lobby, working systematically with congressmen, organizations, churches and communities. Several days ago, a large group of Ukrainian representatives came to Washington, D.C. with that very mission. One of such meetings took place between Mike Johnson with Serhiy Gadazi, whose wife and 4-month-old son were killed by Russians during the attack on Odessa on March 2nd. Importantly, the Gadazi family were evangelical Christians, same as Mike Johnson. Personal meetings like these have a profound impact on a person, and I believe that it made an impact on Mike Johnson. I would agree. And this is where it gets pretty interesting. So Jane Kiev says, meanwhile, some of the largest Christian leaders in the US are on the right side of this. What's he talking about? Well, and I'm saying this as an atheist philosopher of religion. So, I definitely don't have a horse in this race, but I think this is bang on here. This is coming from the Baptist Press. Darling Land joined Ukrainian Baptist leaders in letter to House Speaker. So again, these people are going to have purchase with someone who sees himself as a new Moses and is a Christian nationalist. And that's not a pejorative term. That's a technical political term that Mike Johnson is. Right. The namesake of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement, as well as its current director, have joined 2 Ukrainian Baptist leaders in a letter urging House Speaker Mike Johnson to, quote, consider the plight of Christians suffering brutality at the hands of invading Russian forces in Ukraine. Issued on April the 8th, the letter is signed by Dan Darling, director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Richard Land, former president of FCBC's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission and former commissioner for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. They're joined by a number of Ukrainians, and then, basically this is about giving religious evangelical Christian heft and clout to the rationale for supporting Ukraine. And if anything's going to land with, to use land as a term here, it's going to land with Mike Johnson, it's going to be something like this. So I think this reasoning is spot on. And we saw Mike Johnson. I don't think I reported this, but I almost reported this, and I probably should have done, because I'd look back on it and say, yeah, I told you so. But this was a meeting he had with Ukrainian religious folk, and it could well have been responsible for turning the tide. There's this Time magazine article that's is a fairly big read, decent article, Russia's war against evangelicals. So when you have Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about the persecution of Christians in Ukraine by Ukraine, it is demonstrably false, and in fact empirical data massively destroys her claims. Just to dip into what is said here, evangelicals are targeted by the Russians disproportionately, the Russians that is. And as that story, so this is a chap who was, I think, captured and tortured, is typical for Russia's systemic persecution of Protestants in occupied Ukraine. Protestants were the victims of 34% of the reported persecution events and 48% in the Zaporizhia region where Azat was held. Baptists made up 13% of the victims, the largest single group after Ukrainian Orthodox. Under Russian control, 400 Baptist congregations have been lost, 17% of the total in Ukraine. There's a reason for this. Protestants flourished in the democratic decades since the end of the USSR. Baptists are the third largest dominant denomination in Ukraine. The mayor of Kiev between 2006 and 12 was an evangelical, and for the Russian occupiers, they are perceived as agents of America. Petro Dudnik, pastor of the Good News Church, explains that the occupying forces, quote, thought and spoke like this: "You are the American faith, the Americans are our enemies, the enemies must be destroyed." Now, if this kind of knowledge was presented to Marjorie Taylor Greene, I would like to know what she would say. I would like her to sit down and read this article, for example. Inside Russia, Jehovah's Witnesses are banned, as is missionary work for Mormons. Evangelical groups are constrained by laws banning missionary activity and labelling some groups as undesirable organizations. US Congress Commission on International Religious Freedom considers Russia as one of the world's worst violators of religious freedom, on par with Iran and Pakistan. Like, how can you have these religious... Because Putin talks about traditional values to the Russian Orthodox Church, they think, oh, okay, that's great. That's a Christianity. I can dig that kind of assault on these new liberal values, without realizing that they persecute other Christian denominations, of which America's more likely to be a part of. It's just insane. What this persecution highlights is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is more than just the latest iteration of Kremlin's centuries-old attempt to crush Ukraine's freedom. It is also part of Kremlin's larger war against America. By hurting those who practice in an American religion, the Kremlin can claim it is striking against American power while picking on the powerless. And just a little bit here. But such nuance is lost on some lawmakers and media in America, such as Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson, who accuse the Ukrainian government of attacking religious freedom. It's a twisted situation, thinks Moore, an expert they've called on. While Russia literally murders and tortures Protestants, Ukraine is attacked for trying to find a balance between religious freedom and security. When I asked Azat about Americans who think Russia is a bastion of Christianity while Ukraine persecutes Christians, he shook his head in bemusement. Quote, "The Russians have come here to kill and oppress. That's against God's law, let alone human law." I mean, it's just incredible. Anyway, moving on. Oil supplies from Russia to China in the first quarter of 2024 increased by 13%. That's data from the Customs Administration. There seems to be data up and down at the moment, talking about whether Russia are doing well out of exports, badly out of exports, China well, badly. I don't know which way it's going at the moment. Anyway, not least because the official figures are almost certainly misleading. In January to March, China imported a total of 28.528 million tons of oil from Russia. In value terms, the supplies grew by 17.9% to $13.858 billion. According to the data of the Chinese department, Russia remains the largest supplier of oil to China. Customs in Rostock have detained a freighter coming from St. Petersburg due to EU sanctions, which stopped at the German port unscheduled due to technical problems. The freighter was actually traveling to the US. US, and according to media reports, had loaded enriched uranium and birchwood. So we heard previously that the US is buying enriched uranium from the US for its own nuclear industry. Incredible. The latter is subject to EU sanctions. The total value of the freight amounts to around 40 million euros. The investigation there is ongoing. Moldova has become fully independent from Russian gas. Moldovan Foreign Minister Mihai Popsoy has stated that's really good news, moving away from the Russian sphere of influence and cutting ties economically with Russia in those really important ways. There's been a women's march against the law on foreign agents in Tbilisi, so they've come out against this. There are due to be elections in 6 months in Georgia, and I'm hopeful, really hopeful that they are free and fair, and that Georgia Dream are deposed by a growing sense of exasperation at the pro-Russian government there. Meanwhile, Russia continues with warmongering, accusing the West of opening a new front in the Balkans. So we're talking, Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Albania, I guess Hungary to a degree, Slovakia a little bit, that kind of neck of the woods, a new front in the Balkans to distract from Russia winning in Ukraine. Of course, enemy number one is the UK. I've talked about this before. Russia blamed the UK for things that I don't think the UK are responsible for, because they still have this weird sense that we are much more powerful than we really are in the UK. I mean, it's nice that they think that, great, but I think they're living in like the Cold War era, where it's the US and the UK were really the bastion of I guess, moves against communism and against the USSR. Of course, number one enemy is the UK. They claim the UK is sending weapons to the Balkans and more troops. Recently, Russia's social media was sharing the photos of UK intelligence. Allegedly, they were collecting information from their sources and checking the pulse of people in Kosovo to see if they are ready for a war. Naturally, they say America is responsible for chaos in the region and sends spying planes. A new enemy is France. This week, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs media explained that how Paris and Moscow are competing in the region, and now they also accuse France of sending spying planes. Last July, so on and so forth. You get the point. RT is spreading this kind of disinformation about the activities of these nations, and it's all the usual culprits. But now France is becoming more and more of a big player, because of course France is muscling its way into being a major, the central kind of European defender of Ukraine, with the UK not being in the EU and Macron sort of putting himself out there and Olaf Scholz receding a little. Is now of course they're going to be blaming France for all sorts. Okay, Ukraine is interested in Brazil's participation in the peace summit. According to Zelensky, the head of the state emphasized that Ukraine is interested in the active participation of Brazil, and in particular President Lula da Silva, in the first global peace summit. Zelensky again invited him to Ukraine. This is really important. Brazil are an important player here because they are in BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. This like alternative to the US hegemony that's supposedly trying to get an alternative trade currency and whatever. Argentina has moved away from that and is moving towards the US, and Argentina and Brazil previously were going to come up with their own currency, trade currency. Well, now Da Silva is president and Milei is president of Argentina. Things are changing. Da Silva is, I think, talking out both sides of his mouth, and you could say for good reason, like in a way that Erdogan does in Turkey, but he's also been making some decisions that don't seem very pro-Ukraine recently. So this is exactly the sort of guy Zelensky wants to be courting at the moment. Secretary of State Blinken is visiting China next week to pressure Beijing to stop supporting Russia during the war. This is getting a lot of traction, a lot of news. This is hugely important. That will be a big bit of news next week, and it is definitely needed. China need to have the pressure really put on them, because they are helping Russia immensely at the moment. And finally, US out, Russians in. So breaking news, US tells Niger, so one of the countries who's just had a coup in the Sahel region of Africa, it will withdraw 1,000 American military personnel from West African country in the coming months, are pending United States counterterrorism and security policy in the tumultuous Sahel region of Africa, and they will be replaced, no doubt, by Russians. Anyway, that's a huge video for me. Hopefully it was all interesting. I love talking about that, particularly American politics and the interplay with religion and politics. All fascinating for me. I hope it's interesting for you. Thanks, guys. Take care. Speak soon.